Thank you everyone for coming today. My name is Simon Brozek. I'm an undergraduate student in the Nunn School here, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. So I'd like to start off with introducing our distinguished guest. So Shane Stevens has been Ireland's Consul General in Atlanta since July 2015. Since joining Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in 2001, Mr. Stevens has served at Ireland's embassies to Tanzania, the Holy See, the European Union, Nigeria, and Malaysia. Prior to his current post, Mr. Stevens was Assistant Chief of Protocol for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Dublin. He is currently responsible for Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee as Consul General. We also have Alistair Young, who is a professor and Neal Family Chair in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs here at Georgia Tech. He also co-directs the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies, a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. Beyond Georgia Tech, Dr. Young is co-editor of the Journal of Common Market Studies and was chair of the European Union Studies Association. Unfortunately, Andrew Stanton, the British Consul General, had to withdraw because under Cabinet Office guidance during the run-up to an election, civil servants are not allowed to discuss issues that are likely to arise in the UK election debate. As I'm sure we're all aware, Brexit might be just one of the topics that are covered during the upcoming election. So with that, I think we can get started. So how did we get here, wherever here is? We can start with Dr. Young.
Thank you, Simon, for agreeing to moderate, and Shane for agreeing to participate. I'm very sorry that Andrew wasn't able to join us. I guess it's our own little slice of the turmoil that Brexit is creating. In the interests of full disclosure, I should say I voted Remain, and I can remain convinced that Brexit is an unnecessary act of self-harm. But leaving that aside, to recap briefly, 7 months after the UK was supposed to leave the European Union, it is still a member and will remain so for several more months at least. Since the referendum on leaving in 2016, Brexit has prompted the resignation of 2 prime ministers, 2 general elections, an unprecedented rebellion by the British Parliament, and an unprecedented intervention in politics by the British courts. There have also been 2 versions of the withdrawal agreement, neither of which has been ratified. So, just briefly, 3 key takeaways from the referendum, which will be relevant to what comes up. First is that the question was on EU membership or something else, which was not specified. Second, the outcome was narrow, 52% in favor of leaving versus 48% remaining. And third, the distribution of leave and remain votes is geographically distinctive. Leave is a largely English and particularly rural English choice. Scotland, Northern Ireland, and non-English Wales, as well as most cities, voted to remain. Now, the Brexit negotiations are formally 2 asynchronous negotiations. One, the Article 50 negotiations are the terms of the divorce, unwinding the existing arrangements between the EU and the UK. The second concerns the terms of the future relationship between the UK and the EU. The UK wanted these negotiations to be conducted simultaneously. The European Union insisted that adequate progress had to be made on the Article 50 negotiations before beginning discussions on the future relationship. We'll talk more about this in a moment, but the Article 50 terms are covered in the legally binding withdrawal agreement. The future relationship is only foreshadowed in the accompanying political declaration. Now, while there's much more to the UK's relationship with the European Union than the customs union and the single market, there's issues to do with educational exchange, research collaboration, intensive cooperation in police and judicial affairs, coordinated action to address common problems such as climate change. But the customs union and the single market have been at the heart of the issues confounding the UK's withdrawal to date. Both parties came into the negotiations with red lines. For the UK, this was the insistence that it would regain control over immigration from the EU, and it would end the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice over decisions taken in the UK. For the European Union, it was that the four freedoms in the single market, the free movement of goods, services, capital, and people, are indivisible. So by restricting the free movement of people, that meant the UK could not enjoy free movement of goods, services, and capital. The EU was also insistent, ably persuaded by the Irish government, who played a blinder, that there could be no physical border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. This is an important issue because for decades, Northern Ireland was torn by violence between nationalists, primarily Catholics, who wanted to join Ireland, and Unionists, mostly Protestants, who wanted to remain in the UK. These euphemistically termed troubles killed about 3,500 people. The 1998 Good Friday Agreement brought an end to that conflict. Ireland and the UK's shared membership in the European Union was intrinsic to that agreement. It enabled the abolition of trade borders between the Northern Ireland and Ireland, and it created conditions for an all-island economy. The continued ability of people and goods to cross the UK-Irish border seamlessly is widely seen as critical to preserving the peace process. In November 2017, both the UK and the European Union committed to avoiding a hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. So Theresa May, the Prime Minister who came in after David Cameron was left for losing Brexit, concluded a withdrawal agreement with the European Union in November 2018. This established a transition period during which EU rules would continue to apply in the UK, and during which the two sides would be able to negotiate what the future relationship would be that would replace that relationship. They settled on a methodology for calculating the UK's remaining financial obligations to the European Union and agreed on how to treat each other's citizens already residing on their territories. They also agreed on how to manage the Northern Ireland border. Because the UK and Ireland have a common travel area for people, which predates their membership to the European Union and which they have both committed to maintaining, the real challenge of the border concerns trade in goods, customs procedures, and regulatory alignment. The Irish government and the EU's desire to future-proof the no physical border between Ireland and Northern Ireland linked the discussion of the future relationship between the UK and the EU to the withdrawal agreement, even as the EU refused to negotiate what that future relationship would be. This is what led to what is known as the Irish backstop. And until it is possible to ensure that there will be no hard border between the UK as a whole and the EU, until there's a way to ensure there's no hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, the UK as a whole would remain within the EU's customs union, and Northern Ireland would continue to apply EU regulations. This was profoundly controversial within the Conservative Party in the UK because it essentially meant that the European Union would have a veto on whether or not whether the UK could leave the customs union. The EU would have to be satisfied that the arrangements agreed would ensure no border. As an international relations scholar, I find this fuss bemusing, because the whole point of Brexit was to reclaim sovereignty, and sovereign states can break agreements. Right? There are consequences to breaking agreements, but if the EU had been totally unreasonable about accepting that there was an adequate arrangement, the consequences for the UK breaking the agreement at some point in the future not necessarily be significant. Partially because of that backstop, which was unacceptable to a chunk of the Conservative Party, Theresa May's withdrawal agreement was rejected by the British Parliament 3 times. Now, the failure to ratify agreements is not unfamiliar to those of us in the US, but it is rare in the UK, which has a parliamentary system, and particularly a majoritarian parliamentary system, in which you have the fusing of executive and legislative power. Part of the reason for the repeated failure to ratify the agreement is that many members of parliament considered the withdrawal agreement as inferior to what they considered to be the default condition. For those MPs who favored Remain, the withdrawal agreement was inferior to the status quo of revoking Article 50 and remaining in the European Union. About 28% of MPs sort of clearly indicated this when asked what their preferred outcome of the might be. For hardcore Brexiteers, by contrast, the withdrawal agreement was inferior to no-deal Brexit, which was the reversion point. In the absence of agreement, that was what was supposed to happen, a no-deal Brexit. And that was about 25% of MPs. So you have a situation where over half of the MPs consider the withdrawal agreement to be worse than their preferred outcome. Not surprisingly, it didn't get ratified. Note, however, that there is a sizable majority opposed to a no-deal Brexit. So the third failure to get the agreement ratified cost Theresa May her job, and she was replaced as leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister by Boris Johnson this summer. Johnson was a key figure in the Leave campaign and represents the most pro-Brexit wing of the Conservative Party. Under Boris Johnson, the British government changed tactics and essentially engaged in a game of chicken with the EU. In game theory, the metaphor, chicken captures the metaphor of two cars racing towards each other. The idea is the best outcome is that the other car swerves, and is the chicken, while you continue on and seem brave and successful. The worst outcome, of course, is if neither swerves and you crash head on. By ramping up preparations for a no-deal Brexit, beginning in July and into the early autumn, the British government sought to make credible the threat that the UK was willing to leave the EU without a deal, that it was willing to crash. The hope that this would cause the EU to swerve and would be able to get a better deal. Now, the metaphor of a game of chicken has two problems when we're talking about Brexit. One is in the game theoretic version, both vehicles are essentially the same size. But in this case, while the UK economy is sizable, the EU's is much larger, and the negative effects for the UK would be much greater than for the EU. So it's more like a Ford F-150 challenging that truck than two equal cars. Secondly, in the game of chicken, there is only one driver in the car. And what we had in the context of Brexit is the passenger in the UK, in this case the European Parliament, grabbed the wheel and pulled it to cause him to swerve by adopting the Benn Amendment that required the government to seek an extension to the transition period if there was no deal agreement in place in time for the end of October. I would also say that the UK's efforts to prepare for a no deal outcome, spending money on infrastructure, hiring customs official, various kinds of contingency planning, stockpiling medicines, was essentially like piling pillows onto the front of the F-150 rather than actually preparing. Now, Johnson did manage to get the EU to shift its position, but the UK swerved more than did the EU. So part of the swerve on the EU's part was that it actually agreed to reopen with the withdrawal agreement, which it said it was not going to do. But really the only difference between Boris Johnson's withdrawal agreement and Theresa May's withdrawal agreement concerns changing the arrangements governing Northern Ireland. So under Johnson's plan, the UK as a whole leaves the EU's customs union, but de facto Northern Ireland remains in. There will be customs checks at UK ports going to Northern Ireland. If officials are convinced that the goods are destined for Northern Ireland, then no duties will be imposed. But if they think the goods are likely to be go through Northern Ireland and on to Ireland, they will collect EU duties on behalf of the EU. Northern Ireland will continue to apply EU regulations and value-added tax rules. 4 years after the end of the transition period, Northern Ireland will get to vote on whether to remain in the arrangement. If they choose not to, the agreement will expire 2 years subsequently. So this involved a couple of concessions on the EU's part. It's accepting that UK officials will police trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and therefore indirectly between the UK and the EU, which is not normally what the EU allows. And they agreed to exchange the backstop, which was essentially unchangeable unless there was a guarantee that this future arrangement would ensure no border, with consent in the future by Northern Ireland. It's called an event limit. Boris Johnson, however, accepted a de facto border in the Irish Sea, which Theresa May had rejected when the EU had suggested it, as an outcome that no British Prime Minister could accept. Now, Boris Johnson was able to secure a small majority in preliminary readings on the withdrawal agreement, but a number of MPs voted in favor of that agreement only so they could table amendments to it. These would include things like requiring a confirmatory referendum, adding a requirement that the British government work toward a closer relationship with the EU, and giving the Parliament the right to request an extension to the transition period if no deal is in place. Rather than risk those amendments, Boris Johnson pulled the bill and pushed for an early election, which was where we are now.
Thank you for that. So, Mr. Stevens, what's your take on how did we get here, wherever here is?
Gosh, well, just to start off, I want to say that I'm very sorry that the UK is not in the room today. One of the big reasons we were concerned about Brexit, one of our three big reasons, is we wanted the UK to be in the room when important decisions are taken within the European Union. So we don't like to have them excluded. We like to have them close, not far away from us. The other two big concerns we had in Ireland, or we still have in Ireland, are we fear that Brexit will hurt our economic interests because we have a very important economic commercial relationship with the UK. And finally, thirdly, most importantly, we've been concerned about Brexit because it has been and still is a threat to the Good Friday Agreement, peace agreement. And again, just to get on to why this actually matters for Americans, I want to make two further points. That Good Friday Agreement didn't just magically occur. It occurred through decades of hard work by the Irish government and the British government, where we ended up working as partners. And that sense of partnership was really only developed in the context of us being both members of the European Union. And again, the deal was actually moderated by the US. That deal was pushed over the line decisively by the US, so that the US has skin in this game. The US was an essential party to the establishment of the Good Friday Agreement, and the Good Friday Agreement is one of the greatest examples of US diplomacy ever. So it's something that the US should be very proud of, and it's something that the US has continued to show significant support for. That's one reason why this is all important for the US. The second reason is that, of course, and again, this is something Alistair probably says every day, the European Union is an absolutely essential partner for the European Union. The European Union is the essential economic partner for the US. 70% of all foreign direct investment into the US comes from Europe. We the other big developed market in the world. We're even bigger than the US in commercial terms. We're the natural trading partner for the US. We're also the most obvious partner for the US in terms of in the European Union, in terms of promoting democracy, promoting our common values around the world. And again, as we'll all have noticed in recent times, this can be a rough world. There are a lot of big players out there in the globe who don't have the same values that we have, and who don't have the same approaches to trade. There are people out there who don't believe in a regulated, rules-based approach to to trade, who don't believe necessarily in following up on commitments. So it's really essential that the European Union and the US work together in terms of advancing the global good of the entire world on these areas. So anything that undermines the strength of the European Union is bad for the US, I would say. And the potential of this US-EU relationship has always been well known by US policymakers. The potential has been clear, and that's why General George Marshall, so many years ago, put together a plan which the US put billions behind, which helped set up the European Union in the first place. So the EU matters for the US. That's an essential point. And again, with the UK departing, we're going to see some detraction from the traditional voice that the UK had within the European Union, which is a pro-US voice. It was a pro-market voice. And again, that voice is not going to be there in the future anymore. So, I mean, Ireland is going to be willing to step up to the plate to, again, fill a gap when the UK isn't in the room. But we'll only be able to do that to a certain extent. We're not going to be, obviously we're not of the same size as the UK. We're not members of NATO. We're not big military players. But we'll do what we can. And I noticed it was just last year that Ireland led a coalition of EU member states that blocked a new EU digital services tax that was being developed within the European Union, which would have hit big American internet companies very hard. So that was in our interest, but it was also in American interest. So we're going to be doing what we can to fill the gap. So I think in terms of how do we get where we are, I think already Alistair has done the hard work, has gone through the nitty-gritty of explaining, and it was actually excruciating to live through it, and it was, but not painful to hear it again, the way Alistair described it, the painful chronology of the Brexit process. So I just want to say that at the end of that process, Ireland is in a stage of tentative relief. We now have a deal signed up to provisionally by the European Union, which did a great job on negotiating, and on the other side, signed up to by the UK government. It has to still be ratified, and that's particularly going to be an issue with the new UK Parliament. Will the new UK Parliament ratify this deal? But we want them to ratify the deal. We think the deal is the best deal that could have been got in the circumstances. It's the bird in the hand. We wish the UK was not leaving the European Union, as I've already said many times. We also wish that the UK had decided to stay in the single market. We wish they'd decided to stay in the customs union. They decided not to do those things. So in the circumstances, this is the best deal we can get. It is a deal that will ensure that there will be no hard border on the island of Ireland. It's a deal that will ensure that the peace process, the Northern Ireland peace process that Ireland, the UK and the US work so hard to put together will be able to function as it has been doing over the last 20 years. So we're very positive about that. And again, in particular, that hard border could have undermined a key aspect of the Good Friday Agreement, which was facilitating intensified cooperation between Ireland and Northern Ireland, what was known as North-South cooperation under the Good Friday Agreement. That was threatened by Brexit, but this deal squares the circle and allows for a continuation of that open, free border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. So it's something we're very happy about indeed. Of course, the other new aspect of the deal that's been provisionally signed up to is that it bases the future relationship between the European Union and the US around a free trade agreement rather than a customs union. And that's something we'll work on that base as we would have worked on any base to try and get as close to the UK as we possibly can in the future relationship. Ireland is determined to have, working alongside our other EU partners, we're determined to work towards having as close a relationship with the UK after its departure from the European Union as we possibly can do. But again, the end point of that negotiation will depend a lot on the UK. So maybe those are the main provisional comments I would make.
Okay, I think on that note, in the context of the background that both of you provided, let's look at what is next for the relationship between the European Union and the UK. So Dr. Young.
All right, so the short answer is, who knows? The longer answer is, now, I don't know how to get this to, I can advance. I want to click on the, just be a mistake. All right, so the election started today, formally. This is supposed to be loading the FT's poll tracker, which tells you where things are. So we have the Brexit party campaigning in favor of a no-deal exit. The Conservative Party, which is leading in the polls by a margin, as this will hopefully show, is supporting the withdrawal agreement that we've just been discussing. The Liberal Democrats are campaigning to remain in the European Union, and the Labour Party is splitting the difference, calling for a second referendum that might result in Remain. So basically, all options are on the table. This week's Economist characterizes the election as wildly unpredictable. I could just, can we just forget about it, because I'm now like
Okay.
on to the, so that's where I want to be now. All right. Part of why the election is wildly unpredictable is that the electorate has become incredibly volatile. So this is showing people switching parties between elections. Right? So only half of voters backed the same party in the 3 elections between 2010 and 2017. They're not switching, and Leave Remain has now become a dominant fissure. People are not switching between parties that are pro-Leave and pro-Remain, but they're switching within parties that are pro-Remain among those that are pro-Leave. And there is the anticipation that there will be a great deal of tactical voting. So the UK has a first past the post system as in the US, so people will vote for the Remain party. If they Remain, they'll vote for the Remain party that is most likely to win, whichever party that is. Makes it very hard to guess. Right? Projections right now, based on a poll of polls, suggest a Conservative majority government is possible, but a lot of them are also projecting a hung parliament. And a lot will depend on exactly how the votes fall. It is also worth recognizing that the Conservative Party had a larger lead than they do now going into the 2017 election, and they ended up losing seats. So it is very, 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 very hard to know what's the outcome of the election will be. Even if the election produces a Conservative majority government that adopts the withdrawal agreement in time for the UK to leave on the 31st of January, there is still a great deal of uncertainty about what the UK's future relationship with the European Union should be. This shows the results of the indicative votes under the previous Parliament, which shows that there was not a majority in favor of any of the possible relationships between the UK and the EU, ranging from Common Market 2.0, which is staying in the customs union and in the single market, all the way through a preferential trade agreement. But it's worse than that, because 2 different Conservative governments, Theresa May and Boris Johnson, also had different ideas about what kind of preferential trade agreement they wanted. They agreed they wanted to be in that bottom category, that pre-trade agreement, preferential trade agreement, but they disagreed about what kind it should be. Right? So Theresa May's version involved quite a wacky customs arrangement in which which is kind of like what they've now proposed for Northern Ireland, in which the UK would apply EU tariffs to all goods destined for the EU, but apply only UK tariffs to those that were going to stay in the UK. They've envisaged staying aligned with EU regulations on goods, to continue to enforce EU-style competition and state aids rules, and to not relax labor and environmental standards. A year later, Boris Johnson comes in and has a very different vision, which sees a much more distant relationship between the UK and the EU, in which UK being able to do what it wants in terms of goods regulation, competition policy, and social and labor standards and to conclude whatever agreements it wants with the rest of the world, are prioritized over the relationship with the rest of the EU. Therefore, there remains a massive amount of uncertainty about what kind of relationship the UK wants with the EU. The EU has made it clear that the closer the relationship the UK has with it, the more demanding it will be in ensuring a level playing field. That is, competition rules, social and labor standards. So the UK is going to face a trade-off between close, greater access to the EU's market versus greater scope to make its own regulatory choices. Johnson's camp, it's clear what it wants. We'll see what comes out the next government. Under the existing withdrawal agreement, the transition period ends at the end of 2020. If there is no UK-EU deal by then, the UK will exit without a deal. Trade agreements, the best of times, are difficult to negotiate. The EU's agreement with Canada took 7 years. We're now going to be dealing with less than 11 months, particularly when you allow time for ratification. The only way that is remotely possible is if the agreement is a very, very bare bones, no tariffs in industrial goods, which would be on par with the shallowest trade agreements anywhere in the world. This is the preference of the hardcore Brexiteers. It is not clear if that would, if the EU would still demand some assurances on a level playing field. If they do, it probably will mean there will be no agreement. If that is the agreement, the impacts on the UK and EU economies will not be that different from if you had a no-deal Brexit, because this does very, very little to preserve the current extent of economic integration. So, to be very clear, contrary to what Boris Johnson is saying in his election campaign, ratifying the withdrawal agreement will not get Brexit done. It represents the end of the beginning, not the beginning of the end. But there is also a question not only about the UK's relationship with the EU, but about the future of the UK itself. With respect to Northern Ireland, the withdrawal agreement de facto makes the economic relationship between Northern Ireland and Ireland closer than that between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. That means it is possible that it will enhance the pull for unification with Ireland, which is why the Democratic Unionist Party hates this withdrawal agreement, but backed the previous one. In the context of Scotland, you had a sizable vote in favour of Remain. The Scottish National Party is campaigning on another independence referendum, arguing that Brexit, by taking Scotland out of the European Union against the will of its people, fundamentally changes the choice that Scots voted on in 2014. A second independent referendum will almost certainly be a condition of joining a coalition government. So you have a situation where if the Conservative Party wins the election outright, it increases the chance of Northern Ireland leaving the UK. If Labour is successful, in which case meaning being the largest party and forms a coalition government, increases the chance of Scotland leaving the United Kingdom. Be careful what you wish for.
Okay, so Mr. Stevens, what is your take on what is next for the UK-EU relationship?
Well, because it's so much up in the air, I'm just going to focus on the Northern Ireland, or Irish aspects of that, because even though Northern Ireland is a very tiny part of the UK and an even smaller part of the European Union, it has been a very important issue in this whole Brexit discussion, much more important than had been anticipated at the start. I just want to say a few things about that, and maybe to slightly counter a few of the things that Alistair has said. So again, we now have an agreement, and assuming that the agreement, the new revised withdrawal agreement is ratified, then slightly new conditions will apply to the relationship between Ireland and Northern Ireland and the UK. So it has been agreed that under the new agreement that there will be controls on goods coming from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. But the actual physical extent of those controls has still to be worked out. I think all the parties involved are going to be keen on keeping those controls as limited as possible. And again, if you were to have, if it was a choice between, from a purely practical point of view, if it was a choice between controls across a land, across an open piece of land from Ireland to Northern Ireland with thousands of crossing points, controls in that kind of a context would be hugely problematic logistically. But when you're talking about goods going from Northern Ireland to Great Britain, they have to go across a body of sea anyway, and they really have to go across individual ships or individual planes. So automatically, the practicalities of putting controls on those goods are going to be easier than they would be otherwise. And again, so I think it's probably the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, has expressed strong concerns about this latest version of the withdrawal agreement. But according to my own memory, I don't think they actually did approve Theresa May's previous version of the agreement. I don't know why they didn't. Did they? I thought they weren't very helpful in those elections in the Parliament. Anyway, but they have been making quite a fuss about this agreement, and they are concerned about anything that can potentially either undermine the relationship between Northern Ireland and the rest of Great Britain, or can be anything that can be seen to undermine that relationship. They are naturally very sensitive to anything of that kind because they are by definition a unionist party. But I think in the end that the border controls that are actually in practice required will be less than they are suggesting at this time. And again, let's remember that with this new arrangement for some controls between Northern Ireland and Great Britain has also come a system of democratic accountability. So that means, as Alistair said, after 4 years, the Assembly in Northern Ireland will have a chance to vote on this system. And if a majority of people in that Assembly decide to discard the system, it will be discarded. And again, for those who are really into the technicalities of Northern Ireland, there has been a debate as to whether it was appropriate for majority rule in that Northern Ireland Assembly to apply to this decision. Because on many issues in Northern Ireland, they don't just require majority rule to decide something, they require a sort of backing from both communities, which in practice means a larger than majority vote for bringing forward certain things. But again, this is for the real nerds out there, under the technicalities of the Good Friday Agreement, these matters of trade and international relations are normally matters for the UK to decide, not for the local government in Northern Ireland. So matters of this sort were never meant to be decided under that both community basis decision-making process. So that is why, despite what the Democratic Unionist Party has said, the current plans are in no way contrary to the letter of the law of the Good Friday Agreement. And that's not just my view, that's not just the Irish government's view, that's also the publicly expressed view of the most senior civil servants in Northern Ireland, who are totally non-political, but who consider the Good Friday Agreement to be their founding document and their constitution. So they take it very seriously. Just to make that point clear. And again, I think it's by no means necessary that these new arrangements, if they are first of all confirmed by the new British Parliament, and then over the coming years approved by the Northern Ireland Assembly, if those matters do come in, I think they're going to have a very marginal effect on trade between Ireland and Northern Ireland and the UK. And again, what we know now is that there's people, the business people in Northern Ireland are now going to have the opportunity to trade into the UK, and they're going to have the opportunity to trade into the European Union. So in a sense, they're going to have the best of both worlds. And the actual practical extent of any difficulty in goods moving between the UK, Great Britain and Northern Ireland has yet to be seen, and may be quite limited. The general pattern of economic exchange between Ireland and Northern Ireland is one of smaller scale company transactions. People sell sheep and milk across the Irish border, and smaller scale goods of various kinds. And between Northern Ireland and the UK, it's more a matter of big company transactions and larger scale transactions. So again, I think that will feed into the fact that these new arrangements, if confirmed, will not have a really very big and negative effect on people in Northern Ireland. So I just wanted to make those 2 points about the Northern Ireland plan scenario, because it has been the focus of quite a lot of debate and concern in recent weeks. In fact, our own Deputy Prime Minister, our Taoiseach, went up and spoke about exactly these matters in Belfast, in the Belfast Chamber of Commerce, with a representative from the Dublin Chamber of Commerce just a few days ago. Because we are concerned, even though we think this agreement is the best agreement that can be done, it is not as good a situation as if we didn't have Brexit. Brexit was automatically going to cause some sort of disruption to the very good arrangements we had with, on the one hand, Ireland and Northern Ireland being in the European Union, and on the other hand, proper implementation of the Good Friday Agreement. We were never going to get as good as the status quo. We're never going to get as good as what we had, but this deal is the best we can do. Simple as that.
Shane is right. I just checked. The DUP did oppose the original withdrawal agreement, though they were kind of equivocal. They sort of went back and forth about whether or not they would. And this Boris Johnson's withdrawal agreement they feel is a betrayal. So they do hate this one more, but they don't like the other one either.
Yeah, and again, they did support Brexit,
Yeah.
as a lot of the other parties in Northern Ireland did not do. And again, it's important to remember in all of these discussions, and without undermining the DUP and unionist and sort of hard unionist perspective, that a majority of parties in Northern Ireland did not vote for Brexit at all. And again, that doesn't mean Brexit shouldn't happen, because Northern Ireland is a sovereign part of the United Kingdom, which as a whole did vote in a referendum to leave. But it's still not insignificant when we're talking about the minutiae of policy as we are, that a majority of people in Northern Ireland did not vote to leave the European Union, and a majority of business people in Northern Ireland certainly see this withdrawal agreement as better than no deal, and a large majority of people in Northern Ireland, I think, are going to be happy with this. And if they aren't happy, and their political representatives in the Assembly don't like the deal, they can vote it down after 4 years.
All right. So we've briefly touched on how the U.S. fits into this equation. So, Dr. Young, what do you think is next for the transatlantic relationship?
Well, as with much else, much will depend on the outcome of the election. Last week, President Trump said that Boris Johnson's withdrawal agreement, if ratified, would impede conclusion of a US-UK trade agreement. As far as I or anyone else can make out, that's only in contrast to a hard no-deal Brexit, which would create the possibility for immediate negotiations between the US and the UK on a future trade agreement. But the whole point of Johnson's version of the withdrawal agreement is to give the UK considerable latitude when it comes to negotiating preferential trade agreements with other countries, most notably the US. Rumors are in the US that in Washington, the abbreviation for the US-UK agreement is pronounced USUCA. on the grounds that the US's greater economic leverage and much lower political incentives mean that the agreement is almost, if there is an agreement, it will be overwhelmingly in the US's favor. Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, who is famous for his ambivalence about Brexit, has latched on to the US-UK trade agreement that Johnson's version of Brexit would make possible as a key theme in his campaign, arguing that a vote for Johnson is a vote for this agreement, which would mean lower food safety standards in the UK and the end to the National Health Service as they know it. Right? So the US is alive in the election. Even if we have ratification of the withdrawal agreement by the end of January, there'll still be waiting for the US. The UK is going to be preoccupied with deciding what it wants with the European Union, once it decides what it wants, the negotiations are going to be absorbing, and the US doesn't really know how valuable an agreement with the UK would be until we know what the relationship between the UK and the EU is going to be. So there is going to be continued uncertainty for US business people, right? Uncertainty in the economic relationship. The negative implications, sort of the geopolitical implications that Shane alluded to in his opening remarks are already being felt because the UK is withdrawing from cooperation in a bunch of EU events. We were involved in organizing an event for a climate action symposium at Georgia Tech in September, and the UK was only able to participate in the event because it was called a European event, not a European Union event. So it's already, so it's that diplomatic pullback is evident.
Mr. Stevens, what's your take on the future of the transatlantic relationship?
Well, I think that, as I said at the beginning, the fundamentals of that relationship are so strong that it has to progress, I think, in the longer term. In this, immediate in this immediate Brexit and post-Brexit period, I think there are a few things that are very important to consider. I think the global reputation and the internal strength of the European Union has been strengthened by the European Union's conduct so far of these difficult Brexit negotiations. The European Union has shown strength and real integrity in how it's proceeded. It's stuck absolutely to its core values. The European Union has stuck up primarily for peace. The European Union was founded as a peace process in response to the horrors of the Second World War and the Holocaust, and in this, with regard to this contemporary peace process, the Northern Ireland peace process, the European Union has again come down firmly on the side of peace and has prioritized the promotion of peace on the island of Ireland at all times in its negotiation approach. And again, the European Union has stood up again for the principle of the rule of law. It took the Good Friday Agreement as a bit of international law and took that very seriously. It takes its treaties immensely seriously. It takes the integrity of the single market and the single market laws immensely seriously. Single market, of course, is only as strong as it is today because of great contributions from decades of UK politicians and UK diplomats who helped get it where it is today. But that single market is one that we're going to benefit from in the future, and not so much the UK. And the European Union has stood by the single market. Again, it's also stood by its deep respect for the interests of European Union citizens, no matter what part of Europe they're in, and for the rights of smaller member states. Now, I'm very glad that as a small member state, instead of being sort of an entity of the size of the wheel of that giant truck that we saw in the chicken game at the beginning, that we're actually absolutely part and parcel of that giant truck that now drives around the world, getting the best possible deals for all its citizens, whether it's on trade, whether it's on data protection, whether it's on whatever. We're delighted to be part of that big team. And I think the European Union, by showing this strength and integrity and commitment to the rule of law in the Brexit negotiation process, has made itself stronger. And I think that, on the other hand, the Brexit process itself will damage us all economically, as I mentioned already. It's not going to. It's certainly not going to help the United Kingdom. It's going to hurt Ireland economically. It will have less damage for the European Union and less damage probably for the US, but certainly it's not going to be increasing the GDP of the European Union or the US in any way in the next while. It's going to be it's creating great uncertainty in terms of the trading relationship between the UK and the US, which is an enormous trading relationship in itself. And it's causing uncertainty for all of us. So that is a burden of Brexit that will have to be overcome to get us back on track. And again, I think we're as we get over the administrative burden within the European Union of actually dealing with Brexit and processing it and spending so much time at European councils and so much time in the European Commission on dealing with Brexit. I think as we get over that, and hopefully we will in the next few months, if the UK Parliament decides to ratify this withdrawal agreement, then the European Union can use its full energy to doing the kind of work that it should be doing. So pushing forwards on the sustainable development agenda, pushing forwards with the perfection of the single market, and pushing forwards vitally its most important international economic relationships. So like the economic relationship we have with Canada, which was recently reinforced with a free trade agreement, like the economic relationship we have with Japan that was recently reinforced by a great free trade agreement, and like the economic relationship we have with the US, which is the most important of all, which should be, I think, reinforced in coming years with a free trade agreement. I think that's the direction we need to go in. We need to see less of this distraction and reciprocal tariffs and trade barriers. They're not really very helpful. Trade. I think recent in just the last month or two, we've had a whole new range of tariffs brought in against European Union exports into the US in response to concerns about the conduct of Airbus. Because of US concerns about the conduct of Airbus, tariffs are now being implemented on EU goods. And again, this is regrettable. I mean, I'm not an expert in these matters, but I'm told that Boeing does very, very similar things in terms of how its operations are subsidized by its state. So it all seems like a bit of a waste of time. And again, in Ireland, we're very upset because even though we have no particular part to play in the Airbus operation, and in fact, an Irish company is probably the biggest customer in the world of Boeing. Ryanair is probably the biggest customer in the world of Boeing. We've been hit on a per capita basis harder by these latest tariffs than anyone else. They've hit hard our butter, they've hit hard our cheese, they've hit hard the lovely Bailey's Irish cream liqueur that I would recommend to all of you this evening. So it's been a very tough time for us, and so we don't like to see these tariffs coming in. And again, I think we need to get back to doing the right things in terms of this EU-US relationship. We need to look at the actors who are around the world who are not living up to their own commitments in terms of trade, and often that has been China in recent times. And we need to push forwards with our economic relationship, which is so strong and has such huge potential for the forwards, for the future. That's where we need to go. And we need to intensify our collaboration in multilateral fora and so on. I mean, that's the direction we need to travel, and I think in the end that's where we'll go, because it's always been in the interests of the US and the European Union to be the closest possible partners. So that's where we'll go in the end, I think.
All right, I think that's a good note to end on. I want to thank both of our distinguished guests today. I know it's been very enlightening for me, and I hope it has for all of you as well. We now have time for question and answer.
Is it correct that if the Johnson plan passes, that in 4 years, Northern Ireland will get to vote on whether to keep it or get out of it? Is that what it is?
4 years after after the transition period.
After the 2020?
Yeah, so it'd be 2024.
Okay.
And then there'll be,
And that would be on the Johnson plan,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. They would get out of the the protocol for Northern Ireland part,
Yeah.
but I think it would automatically be knocked back for further discussions. If something else would have to be put in its place, it wouldn't
Oh.
just completely disappear. There would be some further discussions.
and it takes 2 years to disappear, so we tried to
I
find.
can't hear.
After they vote to leave, it will last for 2 years while they try and find an alternative.
Oh, okay.
Could you go again over the Scotland situation? I didn't quite follow why they would be happy. The difference between the two possible outcomes of the government in the next election. It seems to me they would not be happy no matter which way it goes. So maybe you can explain a little better.
Well, the thing is that if you have a coalition government, which would not include the Conservative Party, but it would have to include the Scottish National Party, they would require as part of their agreement to form the government that they would want the UK government to approve a referendum in Scotland on independence.
And so that's why they would prefer that outcome, is because they have some leverage to get another referendum.
Well, well, yeah, I mean, they would prefer, I mean, they also,
The
they also,
Conservatives lose.
well, they want the Conservatives to lose because they oppose Brexit. They are against Brexit to start with, so they want the Conservatives to lose for that reason. But also, if there is a coalition, if Conservatives lose, there will be a coalition government of which they would seek to be part, and which they would seek an independent referendum. So they want the Conservatives to lose for more than one reason.
Sir?
While preserving the Good Friday Agreement is a terrific goal, I'm not sure that the foundation of the Good Friday Agreement remains, because it seems to me that the Good Friday Agreement was a binary agreement between sides that were trying to decide whether or not to stay in the UK or not. Now that the Brexit has undermined the benefits of being in the UK, it seems to me that particularly a lot of people who may be friends of the UK may reconsider re-entering the Republic. I'm thinking specifically a friend of mine, talking to a friend of mine on the phone who lives in Northern Ireland, that she began to cry because her kids, she thinks, will not be able to work in Europe and work and study in Europe. And she is a very strong supporter of the UK, not a unionist, mind you, but a supporter of, she is a loyal citizen of the UK, but she's rethinking it, and she's taken her Irish passport application out of the drawer and is starting to going to apply for an Irish passport. So it seems to me that the Good Friday Agreement may not exist simply because the foundation doesn't exist.
I think I agree with most of what you're saying, but except
Right.
that really the Good Friday Agreement is more important than ever. The Good Friday Agreement states as one of its core principles that anyone who's born in Northern Ireland has a right to be Irish or British or both. So your friend, and again, unionist isn't really a dirty word. Occasionally it's used like it's a terrible thing, but being a unionist, there's nothing wrong with being a unionist. It's a genuine and reputable political position. But there are many people who have been unionists who have taken out Irish passports recently to allow themselves to benefit from their status as European Union citizens as well. And the Good Friday Agreement also is still the absolute bedrock agreement for the constitutional future of Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, under the Good Friday Agreement, is undoubtedly, by any sane person's perspective, part of the UK. And that will only change, according to the Good Friday Agreement, when a majority of people in Northern Ireland and a majority of people in Ireland vote around the same time in a referendum to change that. So that is what copper fasces the place of Northern Ireland in the UK, and that agreement still stands. And again, some things are always changing in terms of perspectives in Northern Ireland on at the margins about whether it's better to be part of the UK or part of Ireland. And again, I guess if the UK does go for this very good withdrawal agreement and does leave, then people will adjust their calculations, and sentiments will change. But that doesn't mean the Good Friday Agreement isn't still the best bedrock for the future of Northern Ireland. It absolutely is.
So we've mentioned passports and people moving. So how is it going to work if the Johnson Agreement is the one that is implemented for a Schengen region person who goes to Ireland without a passport or without need of a passport, crosses the Northern Ireland border and decides he wants to go to England? Where is that passport control, and is a Northern Ireland British citizen, a UK citizen, going to require a passport to go to England?
No.
And there won't be a passport check at the border. There will be but you wouldn't be able to work or something without identification. Right,
So,
so because of the-
citizen can move to and work in Ireland as part of the EU, can cross the Northern Ireland-Irish border without a border check, but requires a passport to get into England?
No.
Well,
Because there's the common travel area, there aren't any passport checks between Ireland and the UK.
but even, the funny thing is that a lot of people don't realize this, but currently, even if you want to go to travel from, let's say, France to Ireland, you still need to show basically a travel document to do that. Because we're not, Ireland has opted out of the visa and travel control aspects of Schengen over the last, 20 or 30 years, so as to preserve our free border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. So we also have special collaboration with the UK on visa and immigration matters, which is beyond what happens between other EU countries. We would want to have no checks between ourselves and France, but we haven't been able to do that even over the last decades because of the importance we attach to a free and open border between Ireland and Northern Ireland.
Okay, basically then there'd be no change because they're already in the border check.
Sir?
A lot of reasons why Brexit happened is attributed to the fact that they did not like the immigration policies of the EU. But there are also two other issues that are not highlighted. One is the financial side, monetary side, and also the regulations. A few days ago on TV there was a British fisherman who was complaining that he cannot do his business, his fishing, like he used to because he has to comply with the regulations that the EU imposes. On the monetary side, financial side, there are other countries in EU, such as Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Greece, that could present problems, perhaps different from Brexit issues, but problems that might come up in the EU, whether they do stay in the EU or not. Could you comment on that?
I would love to. First of all, on regulation, overall, and I'm quoting the EU ambassador in Washington who said this just a few days ago, the EU institutions have been the greatest destroyer of regulations ever in human history because we broke down 28 separate regulatory regimes and made them one. So that means if you're a business person and you want to sell stuff from the US into the European Union, you have to meet one set of regulations. If you're American, you want to set up a company in Europe, you set up in one place and they can operate freely across the whole block. So it is really one of the greatest experiments in world history in unleashing the potential of the market. That's a wonderful thing about the European Union that people don't realize. That sounds very American, but that's what the European Union does in a way that's unprecedented and wonderful. And that is not. And people and the people who managed the Leave campaign and their predecessors who worked for the Eurosceptic press for decades in the UK were very expert and skilled in articulating an alternative narrative But that narrative was broadly false if you look at the big picture. I mean, again, every government makes mistakes on individual regulations, but the big picture was one of where the European Union eradicates regulation and allows the capacity of the market to be properly realized. On that front. The second thing, on the financial side, the European Union does work under principles of where the richest parties support the poorer parties. We have cohesion policies, and we have what's that term? The term for when I've forgotten it. There may be cohesion policies within the European Union, so that the poorer countries are supported slightly by the wealthier countries, particularly in terms of their infrastructure, through the structural funds, through the cohesion funds, through other policies of the European Union. And the richer members of the European Union have traditionally paid a little bit more into the European Union budget to allow for that. But again, the overall contribution that each member state has to make into the European Union budget is a tiny percentage of their overall budgetary output. It's something under is it 3 or 5% or something, isn't that? Yeah, it's really quite tiny, relatively speaking. And again, Ireland, for example, we started off at the very bottom. We were receiving huge amounts of money from the European Union in the 1970s and 1980s and the early 1990s. But now we're a net contributor to the European Union, and we're glad to do so, because it's much greater economic benefit for us in the big picture to be part of this 500 million free market, and to be part of the biggest bloc in the world for negotiating trade deals. So it's economically in our interests to be inside that union. I suspect it would, and I believe it would have been in the economic interests of the UK to stay in the European Union too. Certainly the Confederation of British Industries and all the other significant lobby groups in the UK said that. And then finally, on immigration matters, and again, this was the favorite element of the Leave people, like Nigel Farage, in the campaign. And they, frequently they would flash up pictures of, dark-skinned immigrants, and often suggesting that they were Muslims, running into Europe, and suggest that this was all down to the European Union. But again, the European Union rules only talk about the requirement to allow people from other European Union countries come in to your state. So, for example, Ireland and the UK, we've had lots of Polish people coming into Ireland and the UK in the last 20 years because of Poland joining the European Union. And again, for us, that's been a wonderful thing. We have great bakeries, our Catholic churches are full, and we have Polish beer and great plumbers and great workers, great maths teachers. It's really benefited us having those Poles come in. And again, when people come in from outside the European Union into a European Union country, as the UK has been, that's really a matter of their domestic policy. And again, of course, the UK has lots of people. There are lots of people living in the UK who are from all around the world, many of whom have dark skin, because of the history of the UK. And I think personally, that's a huge strength that the UK has. It's that diversity that it has is a wonderful part of what makes the UK, and particularly somewhere like London, great. But that's a separate issue. The European Union laws only force you to take in people from other European Union countries, not from outside. It's a separate issue. So that, again, the campaign was quite misleading, I think.
Yeah, there were pictures showing the Syrian refugees lining up to get into Germany, and the implication they could get into the UK, but that can't, because the UK is not in Schengen, so could not be. The UK could choose whether or not they would get into the UK, and the Leave campaign also played up the prospect of Turkish membership, so all of these Turks would suddenly be able to get into the UK, but because they'd be EU members, of course, that's not anywhere in the foreseeable future. On the regulation thing, all fishermen hate the EU. Every single fisherman, I think, European fisherman hates the EU, because the rules are about regulating a common stock and preventing overfishing. Right? So I mean, the fishing is a place where there's regulation, but it's regulation in order to preserve the stock. And Shane sort of alluded to the Confederation of British Industry, which was the peak association representing all British business, and they went through the EU's regulations, decided to say which they would like to keep and which they wouldn't, and there's a tiny fraction they want to get rid of. The vast majority they really much prefer to keep. So this depiction of the EU as this overweening regulatory state is overdone, but it fits. I mean, it fits into a narrative of the hardcore Brexiteers, which are extreme neoliberal. I mean, they're very neoliberal. This is all about deregulation. It's going back to stuff we were like in the 80s here, right? It's all about deregulation. So they have a very particular view about what the correct relationship between state and market is, and I can tell you that that is not where the vast majority of British people think the relationship between state and market should be.
But do you think those countries that are not as well off financially domestically, like Greece and Portugal and those other two countries, are they going to be able to maintain their membership in the EU in the future?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, I think so, yes.
If Greece stayed in at the height of the financial crisis, they decided it was worth staying in. Here.
I was involved with the Canadian engineering firm as project manager on the Intel project. And I'm wondering how you got involved as attempting to negotiate 24 different contracts between England, Ireland, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. I mean, that's a tremendous a tremendous load to carry in attempting to negotiate a contract between the UK and the European Union. So I'm wondering, is there any way for Northern Ireland and Ireland to settle, and then settle, the two of you settle with Scotland, and then you go to the UK and you can't?
No.
It's too late now, but I mean.
No, because
You're
only.
still trying to negotiate 24 contracts at once, or 24 combinations of agreements at one time.
I'm not sure.
That seems like an impossible task.
Well, there'll be one agreement between the UK and the
There will
European
be
Union.
then, but currently, because you have the other three involved, you have
But they're not
24 different
sovereign.
combinations.
But they're not sovereign. They can't negotiate.
Well, I know they're not sovereign, but you're treating them as sovereigns. The UK is treating them as sovereign because
No.
they do participate. And the European Union, as an entity, operates pretty similar to the United States in terms of poor states, rich states, poor countries, richer countries. They do the same distribution of currencies.
Well, it works very differently, but the distribution between regions works very differently. But I still don't quite understand the contracts question. But
Well, because there are different combinations of interest.
yeah, there are different combinations of interest, but those are mediated
Yeah, but
within,
they're-
and then they have to be negotiated.
Right, I
between.
understand that, but they're still trying to satisfy Ireland, Northern Ireland, and Scotland together.
And sometimes you don't care about,
And you can-
but the British
No,
government.
what I'm saying is the combinations of them, the mathematical combinations of them, is 24 separate agreements. Because each entity has to have some agreement with the other three.
Except that the UK, I mean, England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, that's one entity. There are no separate, that's
I
one.
I understand, but they're recognized as separate entities. And the
Not
discussions-
internationally, they're not.
Well, no, not internationally.
Except in
I mean,
football,
locally.
when it's-
Locally, not.
Rugby.
That's where the confusion comes from, because they have to vote as a unit, but they all have different agreements.
Yeah. There's
What are the chances of having a second referendum? And what would it look like if that actually happens to be remains in favor?
It's a second referendum on
Brexit.
Brexit. Well, if Labour wins, there will probably be is able to form a government. There will probably be a second referendum. Polling shows a sizable majority for Remain. Nobody has changed their positions. It's about 90% of Leave voters think leaving is right, and about 90% of Remain voters think Remain is right. The difference comes both in there were a whole bunch of people who didn't bother to vote last time, who are all like, oh my God, this is horrible, we should stay in, and demographics. Old people voted Leave, young people voted Remain, and the population is shit. Leave voters are dying, and Remain voters are coming of age. So there's now a majority in favor, and it's been consistent, holding up in the polls for quite a long time, beyond margin of error. And Nigel Farage has said part of the reason not to let Labour win is because it would mean a second referendum, the end of Brexit. Of course, he didn't expect to win the first time, so.
More hypotheticals. So if Labour were to win, they would need to form a coalition government with the Scottish Nationalist Party. Do you think the SNP would be placated by a referendum of Brexit away from calling for a referendum on Scottish independence?
Well, I mean, it depends on exactly the outcome, whether or not Labour is in a position to form a coalition government and whether they need the SNP. I suspect the SNP would want both. Why settle? Right? They'll be in the position to. And then, I mean, it's possible that you won't have a coalition government, right? You may just have Labour as a minority government, and they get support for a second referendum, because they would have the. But if they were to form, as ruling as a minority government, if they were to form a coalition, then I think the SNP would look for that. Indie Ref 2.
I wish that our UK rep were here, but in the absence of that, you could probably provide further insight on what you've just said. I have the latest polls, November 2nd, it shows national polls. It's a poll of polls. It's 38% Conservative, Labour 26, Liberal Democrats 16, and Brexit 10, and the rest don't count. It really differs from how it was in June. In June, they were all about equal, and so it's like Conservatives going way, way up, and Labour's keeping a little steady, maybe going slightly up. Liberal Democrats are going a little down, and Brexit's going way, way down. And so you got Swinson with the Liberal Democrats pounding against Labour to try to get them so they can become relevant above the 20% and get some more seats. And you've got Labour doing this very ambiguous thing that nobody quite understands. And then you've got the Conservatives who are don't want anything to have to do with the Brexit people, and the Brexit people don't have any seats in Parliament, and so I don't know if they don't count or what. I can't figure all that out. Can you put some of that together and wade us through some of this and some of the more likely things that can happen?
Okay. Well, the divergence, the increase in the Conservatives and the decrease in the Brexit parties is Boris Johnson.
Is what?
Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister and
Okay.
going for pushing harder for Brexit. Say, the voters who had been Brexit have gone back to the Conservative parties. That was
Okay.
what that divergence is.
I see.
First past the post matters a lot. So you said the others don't matter. The Scottish National Party has 3.6% of the national vote, but they'll probably get 48 seats because they're all in Scotland. The Brexit Party has about 13%, and they're projected to get 0. So, but the thing is, so Farage has threatened to run Brexit candidates in every constituency unless Boris Johnson enters into an electoral pact with him based on abandoning his own withdrawal agreement and going for a no-deal Brexit. The thing is, if Farage does that, then there's the chance that the Brexit vote will split between Conservatives and the Brexit Party, and one or other Remain party could get a plurality. Right? The Conservative, Boris Johnson is not enthusiastic about that pact because it could push away pro-Remain conservatives and moderate conservatives and make them defect to the Liberal Democrats. Farage has given Johnson until the 14th of November to make his decision, but it's possible Farage won't follow through on his threat because his people are saying you could jeopardize Brexit by doing that. So as I said, there's going to be a lot of tactical voting, depending on who people think is more likely to, which Leave party is more likely. It's not going to be, I mean, there won't be any tactical voting on the Leave side because
And the final thing,
Because Brexit can't win.
Russian involvement. Russia was involved in the last election here, and supposedly, we can't really see, but supposedly they're going to be involved in this election. You heard anything about that?
well, there's a lot of stuff about Russia being involved in the Leave campaign
Yeah.
and supporting the Leave. I'm not quite sure what steps they've taken to guard against Russian involvement in this election. I'm just not sure what that.
Any other final questions?
Great rugby jersey, by the way.
So once again, I just want to thank both of our distinguished guests today. I hope all of you enjoyed this Brexit discussion.